Hi, let us understand about state management in JSP. Whenever we are using the HTTP protocol, the client and server will not remember or the state will not be managed. Let's understand what that particular state is. Let's assume a client is making a request to the server for any page. The server will provide the response and the response will be used by the client. After that, the client and server will forget about each other. In the sense, next time when the client is making the request, the server won't remember what was sent earlier and what that particular client was. So it's the responsibility of the client and server to work together so that they know each other by having some common identity. I can use something like a cookie. So the cookie will have a randomly generated ID and that will be provided to the client saying whenever you are coming back once again use this particular ID so that I know what information I provided for that specific ID. So server will keep on having a record what information was provided for that particular ID and the client will try to remember this particular ID by various means. And I will be using a common object or mechanism to keep on adding the data to that particular object. That's what we call it as a session. So the session will be between one single client and the server and the session will be available for each and every client. Here the client could be a browser or a user or some other program that's accessing the server. And it is very similar to any other object where I can add any data attribute or remove any data or attribute and I can set the lifetime of this particular session in the sense at what time this particular session should be destroyed from the server. Let's assume I am going to have a shopping cart application. So whenever the client says add this particular item, that particular item will be added into the session or the ID will be added into the session so that it knows what all information getting accumulated to that particular session, and by providing this particular ID the server can identify for that particular ID what is the session corresponding to it and what are all the data available within the session. And JSP can manage the session by multiple means. One is using the cookies where I will be adding a unique ID to the cookie or I can have a hidden field within the form. But that will work only when I am using the get or post method of submitting the form and it will not work when I am clicking the link. So for the link I need to have a session ID and a random number generated and append to the URL. And there is an inbuilt option available within the servlet where the servlet will have a session object created by the container. And I can make use of that particular session object to maintain the session between client and server. That is by default it is enabled in all JSP and servlet. In case if I don't want the session object to get created, I can use this particular page directive and make it as false. So the session object will not get created. This is the page directive that we had seen earlier. I will be making the page directive as false. By default the value is true for this particular page directive.